On January 2nd, 1980, U.S. President Jimmy Carter met with his national security team to discuss issues of the day. The result of that meeting would be a geopolitical shift that impacted events not just then, but all the way through to today. I don't think that historically we think enough about that meeting on January 2nd, 1980, because I think that meeting might have been, without hyperbole, the most important event in the world since the Second World War. One that has brought us to the brink of the Third World War more than once. On January 2nd, 1980, the era of detente between the United States and the Soviet Union ended, bringing with it the second version of the Cold War. But more than that, it brought us the Forever War, which has haunted the world ever since. In January of 1980, Jimmy Carter was riding relatively high. His approval rating was nearly 60%, boding well for his re-election chances in November. But his administration was facing challenges abroad. On November 4th, 1979, students in the midst of the Iranian Revolution stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 66 hostages. While the administration was struggling to find a course of action to return those hostages, the relatively high January approval rating was credited by some as being a rally effect as the nation stood together in crisis. Then, on Christmas Eve, some 30,000 Soviet troops entered Afghanistan in what they called an intervention, what many in the West called an invasion. As a 15-year-old sophomore in high school, I saw these events on TV. It was an unsettling time. But I had no idea how much the world was about to change. But the antecedents of what would come to be called the Carter Doctrine came before that Christmas. The Office of the Historian of the United States Department of State explains that a new policy began to take shape among National Security Council staff and the Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs, Zbigniew Brzezinski, in late November 1979. National Security Council staff member Paul B. Hens wrote in a memorandum to Brzezinski November 27th that in the face of the hostage crisis, the United States needed to display a determination to stick it out and assert ourselves. National Security Council staff member Robert Hunter wrote in a memorandum the next day that such a stance was more acceptable to the public owing to increased opportunities, especially with greater American public willingness to see us take a leadership position, a fading of the Vietnam syndrome, but also a sense of greater balance and maturity in the nation about the uses of power. The new policy would be more than theory. On the 28th, staff member William E. Odom wrote to Brzezinski, "The present Iranian crisis seems to be a chance to begin a serious regional intelligence rebuilding effort, as well as a physical military presence. The time for action, therefore, is at hand." While the seeds of the new doctrine were already forming, the Office of the Historian notes that the movement of Soviet troops into Afghanistan added a new urgency. I could easily do more than one episode on the Soviet-Afghan War and dissect that disagreement between the East and the West as to whether it was an invasion or a justified intervention. But the thing is, to the administration at the time, that didn't actually matter. Brzezinski wrote in his memoir, "I discussed that issue, a wider strategic challenge in the Persian Gulf as a result of the invasion, at some length with the president, and stressed that the issue was not what might have been Brezhnev's subjective motives for going into Afghanistan, but the objective consequences of a Soviet military presence so much closer to the Persian Gulf." In the broadest sense, the precursor to the new doctrine may have come in 1947. The Truman Doctrine was outlined by President Harry Truman in a speech to Congress on March 12, 1947, asking for money to provide military and economic assistance for Greece and Turkey, seen as at risk from communist influence. The president said, "It must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." The Truman Doctrine was a primary driver of U.S. foreign policy for decades. It was the primary argument that was used to justify the wars in Korea and Vietnam. I could easily do an episode or several episodes on the Truman Doctrine, but in this case, suffice to say that in 1980, the Truman Doctrine hadn't been forgotten. On January 2nd, 1980, Brzezinski sent a memorandum to the president entitled "Relevance of the Truman Doctrine to Current Situation." In the memorandum, he said, "The Soviet intervention in the present case is both more blatant and more brutal than in 1947. and the Gulf is unquestionably more vital to Western interests today than were Greece and Turkey 30 years ago. The same day, a meeting was held of the White House Security Council, including Brzezinski, as well as the president and the vice president, of the secretaries of state and defense, and the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. A memorandum by Brzezinski summarizing the meeting listed a number of steps, including the recall of the U.S. ambassador to the Soviet Union, suspending talks and ongoing discussions of a number of matters, including opening consulates in Kyiv and New York, consular review talks, joint agriculture, health, and commercial committees, delays in visas for official visits to the United States, efforts to induce allies to deny the Soviets credit, and a joint call with Pakistan to bring the issue before the United Nations Security Council. These were actions that would significantly affect U.S.-Soviet relations, which had been in a relative thaw in the era of President Nixon's détente, but other actions were more ominous. The memorandum suggested, for example, exempting Pakistan from a restriction under a nuclear non-proliferation provision of the U.S. Foreign Assistance Bill, allowing military sales, essentially placing military support in the region over nuclear non-proliferation. And, perhaps most significantly, the U.S. would delay the Senate ratification of the Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement that Carter had signed the previous June. The agreement with the Senate Majority Leader was that the treaty would remain on the Senate agenda but not be taken to the floor for a vote. This action spurred some controversy as the Council agreed that the Arms Limitations Agreement was in the U.S. strategic interest, but the Council concluded, "But at this time, we do not believe it is advisable to bring it to a vote." Carter first gave the nation a taste of the new policy in an address to the nation on January 4th, arguing that the Soviet invasion was an extremely serious threat to peace because of the threat of further Soviet expansion into neighboring countries in Southwest Asia, and also because such an aggressive military policy is unsettling to other peoples throughout the world. Carter included many of the issues addressed in the Security Council memo, saying, "With the support of the American people and working with other nations, we will deter aggression. We will protect our nation's security, and we will preserve the peace. The United States will meet its responsibilities." He further defined proposals in the State of the Union address, delivered January 23rd. The initial reaction was generally positive. He later noted that the speech was better received than any I've ever made. There were immediate impacts. First, Carter called for a U.S. boycott of the 1980 Olympic Games, being held in Moscow. "I have notified the Olympic Committee that with Soviet invading forces in Afghanistan, neither the American people nor I will support sending an Olympic team to Moscow." Nicholas Evan Censuram of the U.S. Naval War College said in Political in 2014 that the initial suggestion had come from the West German ambassador to NATO, as Carter began to realize that he had few levers to pull. The public was supportive. Censuram notes that 55% of the American people supported the idea. The press was enthusiastic. The Washington Post's Robert G. Kaiser opined, "There should be no underestimating the significance the Soviets themselves put on their selection. They have been treating this Olympiad as one of the great events of their modern history. A boycott would be a tremendous blow to Soviet prestige. But perhaps most significant, the collapse of this Olympiad would send a genuine shockwave through Soviet society." But the effort turned out to be a disaster for the president. The Associated Press wrote last year, "In short time, that move came to be seen as a textbook example of the risks, confusion, and low success rate of injecting politics into sports. The president tried to make his case to other nations to join the boycott. 65 did in the end, but efforts to convince the International Olympic Committee to cancel the games and to organize competing games both failed. Meanwhile, the originally supportive public mood shifted as the Winter Olympics, held in Lake Placid, New York, increased enthusiasm for the Olympics generally. Many, even close U.S. allies attended, including France, Spain, Italy, and the United Kingdom. Even Puerto Rico, a U.S. territory with its own National Olympic Committee, attended. The games went on. Censuram writes, "The Olympics that the Americans missed that year were far more resilient than Carter could have imagined. In the end, 80 countries attended, and 36 world records were set." Meanwhile, the Washington Post, once supportive of the boycott, opined last year that, as a result, a few hundred American wrestlers, swimmers, gymnasts, and other athletes of all stripes never had a chance to realize their Olympic dreams. As policy, the boycott simply failed. As the Associated Press noted, the Soviets stayed in Afghanistan for another 9 years. The Soviets were able to return the favor 4 years later in 1984, when the games were held in Los Angeles. The Soviets boycotted, joined by 13 other countries, mostly from the Eastern Bloc. The boycott set a precedent for politicizing sport, stole Olympic dreams, and failed to accomplish their goals. In his later years, Carter was said to have quietly regretted his decision. But there was another reason for regret. Carter faced criticism from both his primary opponent, Ted Kennedy, and his Republican opponent, Ronald Reagan. Robert Strong of the University of Virginia's Miller Center noted because much of the public considered this to be more punitive towards American athletes than Soviet leaders. Carter's response reinforced his weak image. Another provision similarly backfired. In his January 4th speech, Carter canceled the delivery of 17 million tons of grain that the Soviets had ordered. It wasn't truly a boycott. The U.S. delivered food grain per an existing agreement. Carter said that this grain was not intended for human consumption, but was to be used for building up Soviet livestock herds. The decision immediately had its opponents. Of course, as Vance Peterson, president of the U.S. Wheat Association, wrote in 2020. On January 4th, farmer leaders and all U.S. wheat producers sat in disbelief, hearing President Jimmy Carter address the nation and summarily cancel 17 million metric tons of existing wheat, corn, and soybean sales contracts between U.S. exporters and the former USSR. That was 17 MMT of production that had already been grown and harvested and scheduled for movement by truck, barge, rail car, and ocean vessels through the U.S. grain export system. 17 MMT of system revenue, margins, and farmers' annual income, all canceled. The decision backfired, as Peterson explained. Spurred on by the unfilled Soviet demand, export origins in Europe and South America were quite literally handed a windfall on a silver platter. It's hard to criticize them for taking up that opportunity, but that was the spark for many of them that launched them into a new permanent place as competitors of the United States in the export market. Arvin Donley, editor of the magazine World Grain, writes that the ill-conceived action harmed U.S. agriculture more than its Cold War foe. And it harmed Carter as well. Ronald Reagan, the Republican challenger, promised to end the embargo, blaming it for hurting American farmers while achieving little against the USSR. Both issues, which appeared to be political winners in January, weighed on the Carter presidency by November. Donley writes, Carter lost in a landslide to Republican challenger Ronald Reagan in the 1980 election. And the embargo played a role in that sound defeat, although he committed other policy blunders that contributed to his White House exit. In the end, the Carter Doctrine, which was a term coined by pundits, although not the president, became an albatross. It can't be said to have itself cost him the election, but it certainly played a role. But these were the immediate impacts. The doctrine itself was much more far-reaching, as he said in his State of the Union address. Let our position be absolutely clear. An attempt by any outside force to gain control of the Persian Gulf region will be regarded as an assault on the vital interests of the United States of America, and such an assault will be repelled by any means necessary, including military force. The Carter Doctrine committed the U.S. in a way it had not previously to the military guarantor to protect the Persian Gulf and the world's and nations' oil supply. Immediately, that meant more defense spending, negotiations for base rights in the region, the creation of a rapid deployment force that could be sent through the region, and aid in arms sales to foreign militaries. But the shift meant more, as foreign policy writer Philip Anderson wrote in the magazine Human Security in 2023. The Carter Doctrine caused a paradigm shift in the foreign and defense policies of the U.S., a shift that would gradually turn focus towards the Middle East. This resulted in what historian Andrew Bacevich of Boston University called, in a 2021 edition of Commonweal magazine, in reference to a speech by President Biden, the Forever War. He writes, the Forever War actually dates not from September 2001, but from January 1980. President Carter's dictum stands in relation to the Forever War as Adam's first taste of forbidden fruit does to the fallen state of humankind. It is the original sin. So what does this mean to history? Cole Bunzel, a historian with the Hoover Institution, writes, since 1980, U.S. policy in the Gulf has been guided by the spirit of the Carter Doctrine. The results? Foreign policy writer Edward Chang noted in a 2020 edition of the magazine American Conservative that even the response to the Soviet-Afghan War may have backfired. Convinced the Soviets presented a clear and present danger to the global oil supplies, Carter authorized the arming, funding, and training of the Afghan Mujahideen fighting a guerrilla war. This program, Operation Cyclone, was expanded under Reagan and viewed as contributing to the Soviet failure to achieve victory, but it arguably had the effect of strengthening the very forces in Afghanistan that would later form the Taliban regime, which would harbor Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. The 1990 Gulf War was a direct test of this doctrine. Chang writes, the then 10-year-old Carter Doctrine, coupled with the shift towards ensuring regional stability, compelled the George H.W. Bush administration to intervene, initially to defend Saudi Arabia from further Iraqi aggression. Robert A. Manning, a foreign policy expert and former analyst with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, wrote on the website of the Atlantic Council in 2021. This on-the-ground presence dates back to the First Gulf War, and groups have cited it as a key rationale for numerous attacks against the United States and U.S. personnel, including, of course, the one that would culminate in the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The Forever War. Let's be honest. My life and the lives of virtually everybody who will see this video have been impacted, some quite profoundly in at least some way, by that forever war. Now, of course, these arguments that say that all sprung from that meeting in 1980 are all political in themselves, and the leaders since, of course, made their own choices. They weren't bound by the Carter Doctrine. The Bush Doctrine, for example, was more or less a corollary of the Carter Doctrine. Everybody made their own choices. But to give you an idea, to illustrate the meaning of that doctrine, Anderson notes a simple fact. Between 1945 and 1990, no U.S. soldiers died in the Middle East. And since 1990, almost no U.S. military personnel have died anywhere but the Middle East. And if the logic holds, it's hard to miss the irony that an attempt to halt the long, bloody war that the Soviets fought in Afghanistan ended up drawing us into our own long, bloody war in Afghanistan. And that, there's very real questions. I mean, what else could we have done? Was there really another alternative? Could history have been different? History is history. But by any standard, that meeting on January 2nd, 1980, that might have determined the results of the 1980 election, was a profound, if underappreciated, turning point in history. Basevich notes, Carter did not intend to embark upon a war, nor did he anticipate what course that war was going to follow, its duration, cost, and consequences. Like the European statesman who 100 years ago touched off the cataclysm that today we know as World War I, Carter merely lit a fuse without knowing where it led. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.